This is our second conversation in this series on interpreting Scripture. We are working through Dr. Carter's book, Interpreting Scripture with the Great Tradition. Our plan is work in every one of the chapters. One video for chapter is the plan. Today the video will be shorter because we have touched on some of the issues right now. So we want to only to clarify some important things. Maybe we can resume a little bit of what you have tell us, brother. Maybe in my mind I have these things of our last conversation. Like you have tell us that your purpose in your book is to help pastors and Christians to interpret Scripture rightly. That's the end. And the method that you are going to use for helping them is recovering the Great Tradition. So I think those two things are in my mind about the last video. I don't know if you want to clarify any more.
Only to say that there is a break in the history of biblical interpretation around the year 1800. In the Enlightenment, which is generally dated from about 1648 to 1804, 1650 to 1800. That's the Enlightenment in Europe. During that time, a major change took place in the way that scholars in Europe approached the interpretation of the Bible. And so I divide the history of her interpretation into pre-modern and modern. So the rise of historical critical studies in the 19th century, that's modern interpretation. And the way the church interpreted the Bible prior to the Enlightenment, that's pre-modern interpretation. And so basically the thesis of my book is that pre-modern interpretation and modern interpretation both have some strengths and some weaknesses, but in general, pre-modern is superior. And so the aim of the book is to identify in what sense is pre-modern interpretation better, and in what sense is modern interpretation problematic. Because not everything about modern interpretation is bad. Obviously, we've made advances in the study of the biblical languages, which are very helpful, for example. And there are many things that archaeological discoveries in the 19th and 20th centuries have been very helpful in biblical interpretation. So it's not that everything about modern scholarship is to be rejected, but the purpose of the book is to zero in on what exactly about modern interpretation is a problem, and how is that different from pre-modern. And that's the specific purpose of the book.
Yes, the problem sometimes with modern interpretation is not what they propose or teach, but what they don't teach. So they stop in a level and they don't follow. Sometimes I say that to preach, for example, I am preaching right now through the Psalms once in a month in the church, and I used to look to modern interpretation to understand the literal context, the meaning of the words, but then I revised the old commentaries to see how that literal interpretation applies to doctrine and to Christ and to Christian living. So the thing you are arguing is how to utilize the good modern interpretation without taking all the bad stuff. So, and other thing that maybe must be clear is that you are not arguing for any specific method, or I don't know if that's the correct word. You are not arguing, for example, to how to do typology, but you are arguing more for a philosophy of interpretation. Is that correct, brother?
The word method is a very difficult word. For one thing, method is singular. So it suggests that there's only one way to interpret the Bible, and that's a problem because the Bible is so diverse. You have poetry and prose, you have Old and New Testament, you have narrative, you have history, you have biography, you have wisdom sayings, you have so many different kinds of literature that to say that there's one method to interpret it all is very problematic. Even the historical critical method is not one method, but a series of family of methods which share some metaphysical assumptions, and it's the metaphysical assumptions that I zero in on. When you look at pre-modern interpretation, there are many methods. So there's typology, there's prosopological exegesis. That's where you identify who is speaking in each particular case. There's literary grammatical. Obviously, there's that. There's translation issues. Establish the text, translate the text, deal with strange words. There's archaeological background study to illuminate the text. There are many different ways of studying the text. So my book is not really so much focused on, well, here are the 12 steps to exegesis, or here is the method to use that will guarantee that you always get the right interpretation. Rather, my book is about the theological and philosophical assumptions you make as you read the text, and what you expect to get from the text, and how you regard the text. Is it, does it have one author, one single human author, or is God actually the author as well? And what difference does that make to the way you read it? So those are the kinds of questions I'm interested in.
Okay, I think all this is clear for all listeners, so we can jump to this new chapter that is called Who is the Suffering Servant? Brother, who is the suffering servant of Isaiah 53 according to the pre-modern interpreters and according to the modern interpreters?
Yes, well, of course, Isaiah 53 is understood by the New Testament writers as a prediction of Jesus Christ. All of the major strands of the New Testament, Paul, John, Matthew, Hebrews, Peter, they all refer to Jesus from Isaiah 53. In Acts, for example, when the Ethiopian eunuch wants to know who the prophet is speaking of, and Philip says he begins with that text and explains Jesus, preaches Jesus to him. So the church, for its whole history up until the modern period, has always believed that Isaiah 53 is a prophecy of Christ. It's a description of the crucifixion and resurrection of the Messiah. And that never was questioned until the rise of the modern historical critical method, beginning with the Enlightenment and moving forward. And it's only been, well, when I say it has never been questioned, it's never been questioned in the church. But of course, the Jews who rejected Jesus as Messiah, the non-messianic rabbinic Judaism of the Middle Ages, they had interpretations of Isaiah 53, and they saw it. They had a number of different interpretations, but some of them, in particular, saw Isaiah 53 as being about Israel suffering in the exile. The servant is a personification of Israel. Interestingly, in modern historical critical study, the rabbinic Jewish view has been revived, and many Christian liberal higher critics agree with the rabbinic Jews. Now, the huge problem with that is this: when Paul was going on his missionary journeys, he would go into the synagogue. Every time he went into a new city, he would go into the synagogue and reason from the scriptures with the Jews in the synagogue that Jesus was the Messiah. And some of them would believe it. They would be convinced by his exegesis. Others would reject it. Those who believed him became the nucleus of the new Christian church in that city. Those who rejected him, of course, remained outside the church and became opponents. So here's the irony. You have so-called Christian interpreters adopting the view of the Jews who rejected Jesus as the Messiah, as the meaning of Isaiah 53. Why would you be Christian if you thought that? Why wouldn't you, if you think that Isaiah 53 is not about Jesus, well then, obviously the apostles in the New Testament were all wrong. Paul was wrong in his argument. And their opponents were right. Their opponents rejected Jesus as Messiah, quite logically. Paul and the other New Testament writers believed in Jesus as the Messiah. But it all came down to, does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament? And Isaiah 53 is a central test case for that proposition. Does Jesus fulfill the Old Testament? Well, Isaiah 53, among many other passages, obviously Psalm 22, obviously the Levitical laws. I mean, there are many places in the Old Testament where many different ways in which Jesus fulfills the Old Testament. But Isaiah 53 is a major way because it's talking about the sacrificial atoning death of Christ on the cross and that whole theology of how Christ saves the world. So obviously it's a big issue, a major question in terms of deciding this. Do we believe that Jesus is the Messiah or do we not? So what I'm saying is we have a real problem when Christians deny the messianic Jewish position of Paul and the other New Testament writers, that Isaiah 53 is prophecy of Jesus. When Christians deny that, they cut the ground out from under their own faith. And it doesn't seem strange that the Jews who reject Jesus as the Messiah would have a different interpretation of Isaiah 53. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't seem strange that the atheists who don't believe in God would have a different interpretation. What seems strange is that people who call themselves Christians would do this. So I use this as an example that kind of gets us into the heart of the problem of modern interpretation. Modern interpretation has gone off the rails. And the interpretation of Isaiah 53 is my prime example for showing that it has gone off the rails. Now the question is, how has it gone off the rails and why?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and this example that you provide in your book is, I think, very helpful to show from the beginning that there are like problems with the academy or problems with the church and the academy. So I think it makes very clear your thesis. And if a text so clear about Christ is being denied about its meaning, how much other texts that are not very clear. So you explain in your book that these differences between the church and the academy come from a different metaphysics, a different philosophy of ontology. I think it will be very helpful because you use this word frequently in your book to explain to our listeners what are you saying with the word metaphysics? What is the word? Because here in Mexico, or at least in Latin America, I think this word has like esoteric implications or anti-Christian philosophy when you use any word of metaphysics. So what is metaphysics, and why do you say that this is the issue in the difference between these two kind of interpretations?
Okay, metaphysics, the technical definition of metaphysics is the science of being, or the study of being qua being. What that means is the study of reality at its most fundamental level. There are many differences between the things which exist in the world: trees, desks, people, dogs, mountains. Each existing thing has different characteristics, different properties. but they all exist. And so to the extent that all of these various things exist, they all have being. Being is simply the quality of existing. It's reality. It is what everything that exists in the world has in common. It has its being. Scripture says, in him we live and move and have our being. And so God is the source of all being. God is the being of beings. He is the one who exists by his essence, and his existence are the same, meaning he cannot not exist. For God to be, what it means for God to be God is that God exists necessarily. Existence is what it is to be God. He cannot, the idea of God ceasing to exist or coming into existence is impossible, because the definition of God is that God has existence as part of his own essence. And this is unlike all creatures. No creature has existence as part of its essence. You have being, you exist, but you could not exist. There was a time when you didn't exist, and there will be a time in the future when you don't exist. Existence is not part of your essence. It's so all creatures have being and existence. Now, when we think about being, the simplest way to get your mind around this is, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of reality? How does God relate to the creation? And what is the real nature of the creation? So let me give you 3 examples of where this makes a difference. So first of all, do human beings have a nature, a human nature that they share in common? Is human nature what we call a universal? In other words, is there such a thing as human nature that exists prior to the existence of any individual human being, and that doesn't change ever, which is always permanently the same? Christians believe that God has in his mind an idea of humanness, which is human nature, and that all human beings participate in that nature. Now you might say, well, what difference does it make? What if we all as human beings just have our own unique nature and we don't participate in any universal human nature? Well, then if that were the case, then there would be nothing in common to all human beings. And it would also be possible that you could change your nature over time. So we could change in many ways, but we can't change our fundamental nature. And this is a metaphysical idea, but it stems from creation. So you say, well, what difference does this make? Well, take transgenderism. People today claim that a man can decide to become a woman because he feels that he's a woman, because he perceives himself to be a woman. Well, does he have a male nature that is given to him as a gift in creation that he can't change and alter, that never will change? Or does he just have his own nature that can shift and change as he moves along? Well, that's a metaphysical question. And it depends on whether you think that human beings have natures or not, whether human beings participate in a universal human nature, a male universal human nature. Do they or don't they? Well, that's a metaphysical question. Now, another example is, do things have a purpose? Do things have a goal or an end toward which they tend? And if so, is that purpose or end built into them intentionally? I would argue that there is a purpose and an end. So again, human beings have a goal or purpose to see God. That is our end. Our purpose is to see God, the beatific vision. Because of that, we can now know what's good and evil, because that which inhibits seeing God can be seen as evil. That which facilitates seeing God can be seen as good. We now have a criterion to determine good from evil. And so we know if the government comes along and says, you're not allowed to worship God anymore, you can't go to church. Well, we know that's evil. We don't have to go check the statute books of our country and see if that law is on the books and say, oh my goodness, there's a law that it must be right. No, we can know that it's good or evil because of the natural telos or purpose or end or goal of a human being, which is to see God. So to frustrate that end or goal is evil. So metaphysics is so important because it's the basis of ethics. It's the basis for understanding what human beings are. It's the basis for so many things. And where do we get our metaphysics? Well, I mean, we all have views on these things. They may be consciously held or unconsciously held. We may have thought about them and become critical of them, or we may be just uncritically accepting the views of the people around us. In Colossians chapter 2, when Paul is talking about don't be taken captive by philosophy, by the elemental spirits of the world and all that, what he's really saying is not never read philosophy. That's not what he's saying. We know he's not saying that because he quotes philosophers in Acts 18. So he's obviously read them. So what he's saying is, don't just accept uncritically the metaphysical ideas in the culture around you, because they're not coming from Scripture. They're not coming from God, and you will get confused and led astray. Instead, be critical. Think about what you believe. So metaphysics are basically, there's a Christian metaphysics that are a series of doctrinal beliefs that are derived from Christian doctrines, which are derived from exegesis. So by exegesis, we read the Bible, we interpret the Bible, and we find that the Bible tells us that God created the world. We find that God created the world at a point in time. We find that the world is not eternal. God is eternal, but the universe is not. So as we build up a doctrine of creation, we can derive metaphysical implications from this doctrine of creation. So for example, when we know that the world is not eternal, then we know that the world is dependent upon God. And we know that the world is designed by God with a purpose. So it has a telos. It's going somewhere. History is going somewhere. History has an end goal. How do we know that? Well, from the doctrine of creation, which we get from Scripture. But it's a metaphysical implication. And there are other metaphysical beliefs out there in the culture. Like, for example, if you go to India, they do not believe that history is going somewhere. They believe history is cyclical. They believe that there's an eternal process that goes around and around and around. They don't believe that history had a beginning and is moving toward an end. But Christians do. Why? Because of our doctrine of creation. And because that we get that from the Bible. So they have one metaphysical belief. We have a different metaphysical belief. What is important is that as the West becomes secularized and less Christian, many of the general metaphysical beliefs that used to be widely held among all of the intellectual leaders of Western civilization, many of these beliefs have been lost by this leadership group. So now when you go to the university, you do not necessarily find people holding to Christian metaphysical beliefs. And they may hold pagan beliefs, mythological beliefs, Eastern religious beliefs, secular beliefs, philosophical naturalism. They may believe in materialism. Whatever they believe, it isn't necessarily Christian. So in this situation, it's very important that Christians are aware of what metaphysical beliefs are shaping and informing their interpretation of Scripture. Because some metaphysical beliefs will shape your interpretation of Scripture. It's just a question of whether those will be unconsciously and uncritically assumed from the culture, or whether they will be ones that you have thought about and evaluated and compared to the beliefs of Christians down through the centuries, and you are using ones that actually come from Christianity in your interpretation of the Bible. So you're either going to have an uncritical, non-Christian set of metaphysical beliefs, or a mixture, or you're going to have Christian ones. And so that's why it's important to become self-aware and critical of what you believe metaphysically.
So for our listeners, even those that reject most the thing about philosophy, they have already like a metaphysics. So you, in your book, brother, you are only like manifesting the metaphysics that reign, that used to govern in modern interpretation. So would you say that metaphysics is the presuppositions about reality that affects your interpretation of Scripture?
Yes, it's there. Metaphysics is about reality. What is reality really like? At its most fundamental level, what is real?
Yeah. And this affects your interpretation, because if you don't believe in God, you will interpret the Scriptures differently, and you can even talk about contradiction in Scriptures, because there is no governing God that in his providence work out everything perfect in the Scripture. So yeah.
Yes, I think, and as you interpret Scripture, if you have the wrong metaphysics, you will get the wrong interpretation in many cases. So, you can see this today in modern gender theory, is the place where it's blatantly obvious that if there is no, if human beings have just evolved by random chance from animals, then who's to say we won't evolve in a completely different way tomorrow than what we have up until now? And what's to prevent us from taking control of the process of evolution and deliberately causing ourselves to evolve in a different way? That's only possible, though, if there is no such thing as universal human nature. So whether there is or there isn't makes a huge difference to how you interpret the Bible. Do you interpret the Bible as allowing for homosexuality to be just as good as heterosexuality? Well, some people do. And why? What's wrong with that interpretation? It's because they are reading the Bible from within a different metaphysics, an evolutionary metaphysics that is different from the metaphysics of the classical tradition. So we need to understand that we can end up not just denying the Bible, but we can end up misinterpreting it if we have the wrong metaphysics.
Yeah, so, and the purpose of your book is trying to present what is the good set of presuppositions that come from Scripture and should govern our interpretation of the Bible. That we are going to talk about that set of presuppositions later. Right now, you just say that the reason, because there is like bad interpretation, at least one of the reasons, or one of the main reasons, is because bad metaphysics. So we just began this conversation talking about the difference between Isaiah 53 in the church and Isaiah 53 in the academy. We say that the interpretation of Isaiah 53 in the academy is wrong, and you just say that is wrong because it's metaphysics, it's presuppositions about reality. So can you explain for us what kind of metaphysics prevail in the academy? What are the main features that govern in this world of academy, or the academy?
So in the modern university culture, the modern intellectual culture of the West, the word history has become central, the idea of history. So there's an understanding of reality as being continuously in flux. Everything is changing and flowing through time and developing, and nothing is really permanent or stable. And everything that we talk about, whether it's ancient Israel or Paul the Apostle or the writings of the New Testament, everything is in history. And everything is flowing and evolving through history. And so in the academy, whatever is real has to be in history. And history is limited to the material or the natural world. There's no such thing as the supernatural. There's no such thing as a reality that is not in principle discoverable by our five senses. Empirical reality, the reality that we can, engage with our senses, the universe around us. This is all that there is. There's nothing beyond that. There's no angels, there's no heaven, there's no God, there's nothing outside. If there is a God, he must be inside of this cosmos with us in one way or another. There's two main ways. In liberal Christianity, the usual position is pantheism. So God is just another name for the cosmos as a totality. Within conservative Christianity, the view of God is theistic personalism. And that means that God is a being among beings. He's a being within the cosmos. He's in time. He's interacting with us. He's very powerful, but he is not transcendent of the cosmos. He is within the cosmos. He's within time and space. We can't see him. He's invisible, but he's there, and he is interacting with us. Most of the academy, since it rejects the supernatural, tends to move toward a pantheistic view. And therefore, when it looks at an ancient writing like the ancient Israel, like the writings of ancient Israel, it assumes that these writings have evolved as human beings have interacted with each other and with their environment and have invented things and come to understand things in the process of their cultural development and then written them down, and that's where the Bible came from. So, for example, Israel did not come out of Egypt in an Exodus, but rather Israel emerged out of some Canaanite tribes that were already living in Canaan, and they 12 of them came together to form a confederacy. And at first they worshiped the same gods that we see in Canaan, the pantheon of gods, but gradually they narrowed it down and began to worship only one God, whom they called Yahweh. And through a natural process of history, the Old Testament came into existence, and the beliefs that are in the Old Testament came into existence. When you talk about inspiration or revelation, those words can't mean the same thing in this kind of metaphysical framework as they used to mean. They can't mean that a transcendent God from the outside spoke miraculously to a prophet to reveal something that human being could never have known on his own. It can't mean that. You've got to redefine inspiration to mean just sort of like what we mean when we say that painter is a genius. That painter is inspired. Look at the painting that he's done. It's so wonderful. It's inspired. Well, we don't mean it's literally inspired. We mean it's very, very good. We mean that he has an unusual talent for painting. And so that kind of meaning inspiration gets redefined in that way. And what you find in the 19th century liberalism is that a whole lot of words get redefined. So sin used to mean human beings breaking a moral covenant with God, disobeying God's law. Now it's changed to mean sin is the evolutionary holdovers that human beings have that belong to their animal past. Sin is now, so everything, all these words, inspiration, sin, God, they all get redefined within the framework of a naturalistic worldview. And that's what's going on in the academy. And the attempt is to interpret the Bible from within this naturalistic metaphysical worldview. And that, of course, means a reinterpretation. And so this is what I call the liberal project, which is to restate Christian doctrines in the constraints of modern metaphysics. In other words, to restate the doctrines of the faith, Christ, sin, salvation, to restate all these doctrines in such a way that they don't contradict the philosophical naturalist worldview, the metaphysical framework that the modern world has adopted, the anti-supernatural, anti-transcendent God worldview. And so you can see that this is obviously going to be a problem in terms of, there's going to be a lot of, when this reinterpretation, sometimes the reinterpretation doesn't seem to drastic. Sometimes the reinterpretation seems like, oh, that could work. We could just think of it a little differently. But other times it's very radical, and it's obvious that, that it's not going, that there's a big gap, a big change between pre-modern and modern ideas. So basically, that's what I mean. The worldview of philosophical naturalism, that there's nothing beyond the cosmos, and history is an evolutionary process by which things are changing over time, and that is the context in which we try to interpret the Bible.
Yeah, and how much does the church, how much the Christian have been infected from this metaphysics? I think sometimes it's not evident, as you said, but when you interpret the scripture, it shows up how much sometimes we have been like infected with this materialistic, anti-Christian presupposition. So, but we can follow in this way maybe, but many say, brother, that the reason of these presuppositions, of this materialistic presupposition, is because science has come, and we are now free from all that childless thinking about the universe and about God. And sometimes that's the way how modern interpretations compares itself with pre-modern interpretation, that now is a scientific way, because we have now science. How much of this is true? Is this materialistic presupposition scientific, and are the modern interpretation scientific, as they say?
Well, the science only started, science did not start in China, nor India, nor North America, nor South America. Modern science began in Europe. It began in Christian Europe. And there is a significant argument to be made, which I think is valid, that says that science only came into existence in the first place because of Christian metaphysical assumptions. So, for example, because we believe that God created the world through his logos, Genesis 1:1, John 1, God speaks the world into being through the Word, through the Son. And the logos is rational. And so when God speaks the creation into existence, it has an inbuilt rationality to it. Not only that, but human beings are said by Genesis 1 to be created in the image of God. And the church has understood that to mean partly that we share in the rationality of the logos, that we have reason. This is what makes humans different from animals. We can reason. And so because we're in the image of the logos, and the logos created the world through reason, nature has a structure, an orderly, rational structure that we can discover. Our minds are suited to be able to understand the rational structure of the creation. That's the context in which experimental science begins. Because why do people go looking for order? Why do people go looking for natural laws, for scientific laws? Because they are convinced that they exist. Why are they convinced of that? Because of the Christian understanding of human beings and the creation and the logos and so on. If you don't believe in a transcendent God who creates the world by order, and if you don't believe in creation, well, then you don't really have the same incentive to find these laws. So science is the result of Christianity. Atheism in the Enlightenment period tries to hijack science and claim that science is compatible with atheism. It is not. Science will die if Christian faith dies. Now, technology may continue, But technology is, technology can be understood to be almost like a form of magic. It's like technology can work when you are running on the fumes of a previous Christian metaphysical worldview. So it's like modern people have forgotten why there are laws of nature. They just know that if you study the laws of nature, you can develop technological applications of them. But why are those laws there in the first place? Well, think about the word law. Like scientists today talk about the laws of science, but a law implies a lawgiver. A law implies a purpose, and they deny purpose. They deny the lawgiver, but they still have laws. How can that make sense? I mean, it only makes sense because nobody's asking the question. Nobody's saying, well, if we don't believe in a lawgiver, and if we don't believe that there's any such thing as purpose in the world, well, then why would we believe in laws? But unfortunately, now in the late modernity, those questions are beginning to be asked, and what we see in postmodernism is a tendency to even question the reality of the laws of nature. And so we begin to see science break down, and science is now becoming more and more a political game of ideology, a more of people arguing with each other and fighting with each other about their personal will and trying to use science to impose their will on others, but they don't really have the same sense of objective truth that science discovers. And so because there is no, so you even get people like, for example, here in Canada, the federal government is giving grants to people to, on the premise that native spirituality is just as valid a way of looking at nature as modern physics. And so they're giving research grants to people to study native spirituality as a way of understanding nature as an alternative to the supposedly Western patriarchal way of understanding nature through the laws of physics. Okay, well, we're basically saying one worldview is as good as another. Your worldview is not scientific, yours is scientific, but they're equal. And this is what I mean by the breakdown of science. So this whole idea that Christianity is against science, this is a myth. This is not true. The whole idea that science is an alternative to Christianity is not true. Even the idea that science can exist for over centuries long term without Christian assumptions is not true. So, so the idea of Christianity of science being a problem for Christianity, science is what you would expect to be true if Christianity is true. And so science is on Christianity's side. The atheists who try to hijack it are just not, I mean, they're just wrong.
Yeah. And if I believe all that you have said, the question is, from usually the atheist and the materialist says that they have like remodeled his metaphysics because of science. So to what kind of science do they refer when they say that? Because
yeah, so in Aristotle had four causes: final cause, formal cause, material cause, and efficient cause. And so when you analyze something in science, you ask, so what is its material cause? And you investigate the matter out of which it is made. And you're studying butterflies, or say you're studying dogs, so you investigate the anatomy of the dog. Okay, and you study the efficient cause. And what happened in the early modern period, 1600s, was that people began to notice that when you when you study things in nature and you study their efficient and material cause, you can make predictions about the behavior of those entities under different conditions, which allows you to make technological applications. And they noticed that you could make steam engines, and you could make windmills, and you could make machines, and you could make all kinds of things without any investigation into their formal or final cause. You just needed to know their efficient and material cause. And so somewhere in the Enlightenment period, in the 1600s and 1700s, science increasingly began to ignore questions of formal and final cause. And they began to study nature only on the basis of efficient and final cause, efficient and material cause. And why did they do this? Because they were not really interested in wisdom. They were only interested in power. Wisdom is where you understand why things are the way they are. So, for example, why are human beings created in two sexes? What is the purpose of male and female? Reproduction. But why do we understand, why are male and female created the way they are? Well, because a husband and a wife both contribute to reproduction, both are necessary, not just in terms of the biology of conception, but in terms of raising the child as well. The woman is incapacitated by pregnancy and caring for small children. She needs a man to perform those functions that she can't perform. He needs a woman to perform the functions he can't perform, but the two of them together can raise a child successfully. So the purpose of human biology is the family. The family is intended as part of the design of the nature of creation itself. Of course, we know this from the Bible, but we can also discern it just from looking at nature. But the reason we can discern that the family is the goal of biology is because we have a belief in final causation. We understand that the purpose of biology has a this is wisdom. Wisdom is where we understand the purpose for which things were created the way they are. But modern technological science pushes that aside and says we don't care what reason you have biology for. We just want to understand the biology. We want to see if we can figure out if we can take a sperm and an egg, put them in a test tube, and create a fetus. Why do you want to do that? Well, we just want to explore the possibilities. And why do you want to do that? Well, eventually, what they want is power. They want to be able to control human reproduction. They want to impose human will on the reproductive process. So, for example, to help infertile couples become pregnant, or to eliminate the family altogether and have all human beings conceived in a laboratory, as in Huxley's Brave New World. The point is that when you eliminate final and formal causation from your view, and all you focus on is efficient and material causation, two things follow. Number one, you can efficiently create technology. And number two, you can impose human will instead of looking for the divine purpose for which things were created. And so this is why modern science has developed the way it has developed. There is something about it, it's no longer really seeking the truth about reality so that we can submit to reality. It's seeking to impose our will, whatever our will turns out to be, on reality, to shape reality according to the way we want it to be. We want to make choices. Are we going to have a family, a society based on families, or are we going to have all children conceived in the laboratory and abolish the family? We want that to be our decision as human beings. But really, if we are submitting to God's will for his creation, then what we should do is we should consider formal and final causation and not consider our science of biology to be complete in itself, but to understand it as understand what are the ethical, moral and social implications of the nature of human biology, and where does the family fit into that, and how is the family the part of God's plan, and why is marriage then the foundation of the family, and then what is marriage and why is it indissoluble, and so on. And so all these things flow from a consideration of final causation. So what I'm saying is that we have a society that invented science on the basis of Christianity, but then has rejected science as a pursuit of wisdom and embraced science only as a pursuit of power. And that's what's going on in our modern society.
Yes, and the problem is also that they have imposed their anti-Christian presupposition of that kind of science, that the presuppositions that came mainly from the Enlightenment. And the issue, or the point I was looking to arrive is that these materialistic presuppositions in the world, even in the scientific world, many times are affecting the way that interpretation is done in Christianity. Because you quoted Ian Proban and Longman, and you say that the academy is a community of interpretation with its own presuppositions and tradition, just as are the synagogue and the church. And the point that you were making with that quotation is like showing that the materialistic presuppositions are not like scientific, like hard science, but is more like a philosophy of life. Maybe if you want to share something of that, you want to provide some clarity on that, and we can maybe finish with that last point.
Yeah, well, the modern university should be a place where different worldviews, metaphysical frameworks clash and debate. But in reality, one metaphysical framework usually tends to dominate in any particular cultural institution. So in any particular university or any particular period of time, or any cultural entity that exists, usually has a dominant metaphysics. And so the idea that the church has a metaphysics but the university doesn't, this is just not true. In many ways, what we see is a metaphysical interpretation of science that is a rival to Christianity that has become dominant within modern universities. It's really like a rival religion. And so science itself, I mean, they try to pretend that science is theirs, it belongs to them, they created it, they invented it. But in reality, that's not true. Christianity, the church invented science, and science belongs to Christianity in the sense that you can't separate science from the presuppositions of rationality and nature and the ability of the human mind to comprehend it and so on. But it's almost like the relationship between Islam and Christianity. So Christianity exists, and then all of a sudden, at a certain point in time, in the 7th century, Islam emerges, and Islam takes over the Bible and assimilates it into its own interpretation and adds new interpretation, the Quran, to it. And then Islam claims that the Bible is part of Islam, and it doesn't really belong to the church anymore. But really, what Islam is it's a heresy. It's a heretical cult. It's an offshoot of Christianity. So what happens is that science is like Islam. It's like or modern science. I don't mean real science, but I mean the institutions, the scientific institutions are dominated by people who are functioning as a heretical offshoot religion from Christianity. And they will eventually die. And this is why the Great Tradition is so important, because 500 years from now, the Great Tradition will be continuing. But the modern Western cult that has arisen may be dead. But Christianity and the Great Tradition will go on, just as it always has.
Yes, maybe to finish, I will say that in the same way as in the scientific academy, you have like an atheist and a Christian, and they see like the evidence and they arrive to different interpretations about the issue. The thing is not because Christianity is against science, but because they are interpreting the data with different presuppositions. And in the same way, that happens with the scripture. They interpret the scripture, but with different presuppositions. That's why we have two different competing models of interpretation of Isaiah 53. You will agree with that?
Yeah, that's
brother?
exactly right. We have the data, we have to distinguish between the scientific data and the framework in which that data is interpreted. And so it's the framework that will affect the way you understand the facts on the ground. And the facts are common to both the atheist and the Christian, but they interpret those facts differently.
Okay. Well, if you have any thought to add, you can, or we can finish here. And there are some other points that we were not able to touch, but we can talk about in the next.
I think we can talk about it next time. Maybe next time we can start out by talking a little bit about the theological interpretation of Scripture, about that phrase and whether it's useful.
Yeah.
All right. Very good.